Murder on the Orient Express was the first Agatha Christie novel that I read at the age of 10, and it made me fall in love with her works. Mary Debenham, with her cool efficiency in the way she was eating her breakfast and called to the attendant for more coffee, which bespoke her knowledge of the world and of traveling, became one of the first women I wanted to be like when I grew up. The kind of young woman who could take care of herself with perfect ease wherever she went. 2 decades later, I still believe this story to be remarkable, and I want to talk about its core appeal and touch upon several screen adaptations. Murder on the Orient Express is a classic whodunit, taking place on a luxurious train that becomes snowbound while crossing Europe. A man is found dead in his compartment. It is quickly revealed that he was responsible for the kidnapping and killing of a little girl in the United States several years before. A plot element inspired by real-life events. Poirot begins to investigate. The story unfolds. The novel has gained quite an iconic status thanks to its memorable setting and the solution to the mystery, and has been brought to screen multiple times. The 3 adaptations that kept both the setting and the period intact are the 1974 film by Sidney Lumet, the 2017 film by Kenneth Branagh, and the 2010 television episode of Agatha Christie's Poirot. I'm not going to rank these adaptations though, not in their entirety. Their treatment of Christie's story is sometimes surprisingly similar, and sometimes vastly different. The differences are determined by each creator's vision, by the demands of the genre, the medium, and the times, as well as the need for commercial success. And while Branagh's film, with its stellar cast, had its equally star-studded predecessor to play against, the creators of Agatha Christie's Poirot were in many ways bound by the iconic image of the Belgian detective that David Suchet has been shaping for decades. It is fascinating to compare the combination of all those factors together, but it is not this essay's job. Because in the case of the Orient Express, the book is so central to me, these adaptations interest me primarily as illustrations of how we perceive different themes when we interact with the story and bring them to the forefront. Those themes often boil down to 2 options: the assembly of larger-than-life characters and the ideas of justice and revenge. Looking at the plot, no one could deny their central position, but I have never perceived those as the heart of the story. To me, the reason why Murder on the Orient Express lives and breathes and works as a mystery lies with the power of conversation and the routines of human interaction, especially those of traveling. This is what I'm going to talk about, calling upon those aspects of adaptations that are relevant to the themes I'm highlighting. First of all, conversations on the Orient Express are what the investigation is actually made of. Now, in Agatha Christie's novels, psychology generally takes precedence when it comes to uncovering a crime. Her detectives rely on their knowledge and understanding of human nature more than on physical clues, and are vocal about the method. As one of Christie's biographers, Laura Thompson, notes, what is being solved in her works is not the act of murder, but the human dynamic. That is where the reader seeks clarity, within the suspects, the characters, the people. But in the Orient Express, this importance of psychology is doubly emphasized. For one thing, most pieces of material evidence are confusing and inconclusive. There are too many clues, they are contradicting one another, they might not be what they seem, and sometimes directly challenge Poirot.
You opening a dress shop?
Besides, with the train stuck in the snow, he has no means to inquire for any information about the passengers, that is, the suspects, or verify anything they tell him. Without any usual means to figure things out, all Poirot can do is talk. The conversation becomes key to solving the mystery. And the key to conversations themselves lies in Poirot's approach. He interviews people differently, according to their characters, develops a process to decide whether to believe someone or not. Proceeding with his guesses, Poirot lays out his traps, conducts his little experiments, and observes people's reactions. He says a thing, and an elderly lady reacts by looking at her hands, and it matters. He throws in an irrelevant remark, and the man suddenly tears up, blaming it on the snow, and this matters as well. The puzzle that Poirot assembles comes not from digging hard and deep, but from careful, meticulous touch and the vibrations it creates. The central role of the conversation is often considered to be the novel's weakness, depriving it of variety and dynamic. The creators of the 2017 adaptation responded to this perception by placing interviews in various spaces and introducing more action elements to the story, as is their right. To me, those conversations are one of the strongest features of the book, and I do think the 2010 and the 1974 films have wonderfully reflected that. Sidney Lumet, for instance, made most interviews happen in the same car. And because we're not distracted by the change of background, the differences in the passengers' behavior stand out. Besides, as Ray Hark notices, by stressing the cramped interior spaces of the train, Sidney Lumet also heightens the confrontational nature of all the interrogations, which makes us not simply not know who did it, but to suspect all of them.
He did it. He did it. Monsieur, she did it.
But as significant as conversations are for the investigation, they are also central to the fabric of the mystery. Before I go into more detail, there is an important observation to make. When it comes to the Orient Express, there is a persistent and relatable urge to zero in on the extraordinary of the novel. Everything in it stands ready to be romanticized. The luxury of the train, the crimson crime on it, the surroundings, the spectacular kingdom of isolation. The emphasis on the latter is especially visible in recent adaptations, with their widescreen scenery shots, or the outside cold creeping into the train, rhyming with the disintegration of the characters. The appeal of that imagery for the screen is undeniable. But if one were to treat the snow as a mere circumstance, as the book does, and the train as the main and rather plain scene for the events, as in fact Sidney Lumet does, then one would be left with a story about human interactions during a long journey, about conversations that happen on the train. And that is what immerses us into the narration and tricks us into the mystery. It begins in chapter 1, when a young lieutenant is seeing Poirot off from Aleppo, and they share one of those awkward, endless, pointless, pre-departure small talks.
The Church of Santa Sofia is absolutely magnificent.
You have seen it?
No.
And while that little scene is of no consequence to the plot, it is important for the story because it plunges us headfirst into the atmosphere of traveling, making us expect more of its routines, and it is important to maintain that impression. Then we are on the train, and meet a group of passengers who are to spend several days under one roof, and then part ways, never to see each other again. This is an unoriginal travel sentiment, but this is precisely why it works, rooting us further within the train's atmosphere, creating the scene for the interaction of the travelers, every one of whom is introduced to us as a stereotype, and I cannot help thinking there is some purpose to it. That they are presented as the 1930s stereotypes, based on social status, nationality, and occupation, is neither relatable nor commendable, but that they are stereotyped is consistent with this kind of encounter. More often than not, we do perceive our fellow travelers as types. We need to make sense of who they are because of how closely we are brought together, but we don't have the time or the space for deeper insight, and making use of preconceived categories can help. I imagine Agatha Christie to have been familiar with that inclination, the experienced traveler that she was. And while all screen adaptations obviously had to give dimension to those types, I feel a bit disheartened that so many characters, mostly female, although not exclusively, were expanded into the various levels of neurotic and fanatic with little to no suggestion from the book. Not that it's wrong to reflect trauma in their behavior, but I wish it wasn't the only way of expanding their personalities, and that there was a wider range of imaginations bringing Agatha Christie's women to life. But back to the journey. The relatability of it continues when it comes to individual interactions of the passengers and to the group dynamic into which they are falling. As the train enters the second day of its journey, the barriers between the strangers are breaking down. When the train is stalled, the barriers deteriorate completely, uniting everyone by common misfortune. And as the events related to the murder unfold, the crowd reactions come to the surface. And because these depictions of how we travel, how we feel, how we see, how we interact, what we say, fall together seamlessly, and because that human dynamic is so familiar, so expected, Poirot buys into it, and we readers do too. It leads us to believe that the passengers really are strangers. And this is the reason why the mystery works. Not the only reason, but a significant one. While reveling in the details of those strangers of all classes, of all nationalities, of all ages, coming together, united by death, we can't even imagine straight away that they have already been linked by a different tragedy. Murder on the Orient Express, as I have already mentioned, asks to be extraordinary, which is not a bad thing, because in many ways it is. But to me, it also urges us to cherish the ordinary, the patterns of human behavior that are still recognizable to us, even though many specific realities of 1934 are not. Kenneth Branagh said about his adaptation, "I wanted you to feel the snow and smell the steam. I wanted you to have all the advantages of classic material, and none of the disadvantages of over-familiarity." But I wonder, to what extent can we connect with the story once the familiarity is not there to balance the extravagance out? And neither steam nor snow is something you're likely to feel when you are inside the train, experiencing the journey, most of which is constructed of very ordinary, monotonous hours. The most extraordinary moment of the novel takes place in the final chapter, and it also happens in words. And while technically the chapter centers on Poirot and his solutions, the emotional impact of it is carried out by Mrs. Hubbard, and her speech is its true soul. Mrs. Hubbard is the only passenger on the train whose stereotype was assigned to her not only because of her nationality or social status, but also her personality, for she needed the strongest alibi. Always talking, always in charge of everyone's attention, full of opinions, she's also one of the most recognizable types you can get stuck with on a train.
You must excuse me, Mrs. Hubbard is upon us.
Agatha Christie has once traveled with such a Mrs. Hubbard. It was then that I became acquainted with one of the first dangers of travel, she wrote after. I have traveled with such a Mrs. Hubbard as well. And because Mrs. Hubbard is so excellent at being herself, her transformation into Linda Arden is gut-wrenching. In that one moment, her presence changes its scope entirely.
You're an awfully clever man.
The films, of course, visualized it with the use of wigs. In the book, though, it only happens by Mrs. Hubbard changing her voice.
I've always heard she wanted to play comedy parts.
And in that new, soft, rich, dreamy voice that has thrilled many a New York audience, she tells the story of their pain and their plan. We learn that the decision to carry out the death sentence belonged to all of them. We are reminded that Cassetti only escaped justice because of the failings of the legal system, and that forced the family to take matters into their own hands. And then Linda Arden says she is willing to take responsibility for the murder, which in that social context is important. She's protecting not only her family, but the entire household.
They're good people.
Her speech, its arguments, and its emotional power settles the question of justice and revenge. But it settles it for us, really, for the readers. For Poirot, it has already been settled. In the book, Poirot has known the answer for a while, and in the end, he offers two solutions, the real one and the one that will take the blame off the passengers. He even twists a couple of facts to make his fake theory more believable, and leaves the final decision to his friend Monsieur Bouc, knowing full well what solution the kind and sympathetic director of the Compagnie de Wagon will settle on. This scene is extraordinary because only in this book Poirot decides it is excusable to kill, and it brings to my mind the concept of sensitivity, which Jenny Odell wrote about, quoting the Italian philosopher Franco Berardi. Sensitivity involves a difficult, awkward, ambiguous encounter between two differently shaped bodies, and due to the effort of sensing, the two entities might come away from the encounter a bit different than they went in. The recent adaptations showed us exactly how much Poirot struggles to let the group go without punishment, cleverly writing his psychological journey into their scripts, rhyming his arc with larger questions about what represents justice and whether an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is a way toward a civilized behavior. But as irresistible as this material is for adaptations, it fails to move me as much as the book does. What I have always loved most is the ease with which Poirot lets himself be changed by the story he encounters. He still hates when people obstruct justice, but doesn't hesitate to take his place among the passengers. And then the decision is made, and Poirot walks away, and the train is on the move again, as are their lives, and the mystery is left in unremarkable Yugoslavian fields, and will remain unspoken of. My favorite scene from the 1974 film is the moment when the Orient Express gets stuck in the snow. There is no grandeur of an avalanche or the danger of speed. All we see is the dead and quiet of a winter night in the middle of nowhere. This moment, too, is relatable and is chilling, full of emptiness, silence, and the unknown. When the train took off from Istanbul, the conspirators' plan was also in motion. And then it was done, and the train was stopped, and destiny happened to them, embodied by Hercule Poirot. And all the passengers could do was to keep playing strangers on the train, and to keep lying, all through conversations. And all Poirot could do was to find out the truth, with the same means as his only means. Ultimately, the story, the one of the book, doesn't need the overly dramatic moral dilemma, chases or avalanches. It shows how dramatic a simple conversation can be, and it feels fantastic. I want to say in this day and age, but actually in all days and in all ages, among people of all classes, of all nationalities.